Quit Like a Millionaire by Kristy Shen. Introduction. Growing up, I was told that because I was born poor, didn't speak English, and had the wrong skin color, the opportunities open to other kids weren't open to me. I wanted to get rich, travel the world, and write books for a living. Those dreams simply would never come true, the haters said. The haters were wrong. At the age of 31, I became a millionaire and quit my job, and now I travel the world and write professionally. But before I get into my journey, you should know that this is not a happy-go-lucky self-help book. The key isn't to think yourself rich, or think positively, or be in tune with the energy of the cosmos. I've read those books, tried their advice, and none of them worked. I'm not going to tell you what you want to hear. I am, however, going to tell you the truth. Getting rich isn't fast or easy. Anyone who tells you otherwise had advantages or is trying to trick you into giving them money. I'm not here to trick you. I don't need your money. I'm already a millionaire, remember? In fact, this book almost didn't exist at all. Since I didn't buy Apple stock at $10, invent the next Snapchat, or do anything all that exceptional by the time I was 30, I thought my story wasn't that interesting. If I showed you my university transcript, you'd see I'm not even that smart. Why would anyone care? It took an editor from Penguin Random House, Nina Shield, to convince me that my story is worth telling. She told me that it is valuable because I didn't get rich with advantages or luck. This means my journey is accessible to anyone. My journey also spans the entire socioeconomic spectrum. I was born into abject poverty at one point. My whole family lived on 44 cents a day. So my hope is that no matter where you are, you'll recognize your experience and mine. Whether you're trying to break out of poverty, or middle class and wondering how 401k works, or a 1%er who wants to learn how to tax optimize an investment portfolio, part of my story runs parallel to yours. You may find these lessons new to you or skim a section because it doesn't apply. Both are fine. Figure out where your path matches up with mine, then copy what I did. We should end up at the same finish line. Getting rich isn't fast or easy. It is, however, simple and reproducible. I now understand that reproducibility is what makes my story valuable. After I discovered FIRE, short for Financial Independence Retire Early, and created my blog, Millennial Revolution, to teach people how to do it, too, the site quickly became a resource within the early retirement community. Readers implemented my advice and it worked. The answers to questions such as should I buy a house? Or should I go into debt to change careers? Became clear once they converted the costs into time spent working for someone else. At the end of the day, it isn't about money, it's about time here and how to use it wisely to live the best life possible. This book exists because these lessons I learned plowing my way from the bottom 1% to the top 1% are available to everyone, regardless of race, the amount of money in your checking account, and the privilege you may or may not have inherited. No matter who you are, everyone should know how to quit like a millionaire. Let's get started. Part 1. Poverty. Chapter 1. Blood Money. One of my fondest childhood memories is digging with my friends in a medical waste heap in rural China. As we sorted through the piles of latex gloves, soiled gowns, and used syringes, a tiny voice in the back of my 5-year-old head suggested that maybe this wasn't such a great idea. But that was overridden by a much louder, more hopeful voice saying, "What treasures will I find today?" Now, don't get me wrong. I didn't live inside the medical waste heap. I'm not a troll. But I did enjoy it because unlike in a real store, if I saw something I wanted, I could actually get it. Otherwise, a typical experience went like this: "Mom," I would say, my face pressed up against a glass case, "I know we're poor and we don't have any money. But one day, when I grow up, and I make my own money, then can I have that doll?" And somehow the answer was still number. So that's why my friends and I were behind the hospital that day. If I couldn't buy a toy, I reasoned, maybe I could make one. I did find something, believe it or not, in a seemingly infinite supply of discarded rubber bands. We tied the loops together to form a chain and then made the chain into a Chinese jump rope. The best part was that every time our rope broke I could repair it by just swapping out the wonky rubber band. These days, this would be considered grounds for child services to get involved, but back then, this was just what life was like. We were dirt poor. And when you're dirt poor, your choice isn't between Barbie and My Little Pony. Your choice is between food, heat, and medicine, in that order. Toys never even entered the picture. According to the US Census Bureau, in 1987, the national average wage in the United States was $18,426.51 per year per person. One in China, it was 1,459 Chinese yuans, or $327 per year per person. To put that in perspective, earning enough to buy a Nintendo Entertainment System Deluxe set, at its then retail price of $179 would have taken the average American worker less than a week. But for the average Chinese worker, the better part of a year. Also, $327 per year was the earnings of the average individual, which included everyone in major urban centers. We lived in Ping, a rural village with a population of just 3,000, so salaries were even lower, around 2/3 less. My entire family income, at one point, was 600 Chinese yuans, or $161 per year, or 44 American cents per day. My dad, my mom, and I had to live on less than 1% of an average American's daily salary. I'm not telling you all this to crap on my childhood or make you feel bad for me. In fact, I'm pretty grateful that I grew up in this way, because I ended up developing something called the scarcity mindset, which played a big part in making me who I am today. What is the scarcity mindset? To understand the scarcity mindset, let's go back in time. The year was 1945. On January 27th, the Soviet army entered Auschwitz and liberated 7,000 men, women, and children from the largest death camp the Nazis had built. Naturally, the soldiers' first instinct was to open up their army rations and say, "Take it. Take it all." Turns out that was the wrong thing to do. The prisoners gorged on the food and ended up becoming horrendously sick, some even dying. They didn't realize it at the time, but giving a starving person too much food causes their blood sugar to spike, which leads to a dangerous drop in electrolyte levels, a medical condition that would later be known as refeeding syndrome. Near the end of the war, scientists at the University of Minnesota ran a study to figure out the safest way to treat starving people. 436 men agreed to be put into a dorm, starved, sufficiently starved but not dying starved, and monitored. Sitting became excruciating. Pillows had to be placed between their bottoms and the chairs because they had lost so much fat it hurt. They swelled up like blowfish. Extra fluid started collecting under their skin, a condition called edema, and caused a semi-permanent dimple whenever anything pressed into their bodies. They were so weak they couldn't even take a shower, they just didn't have the energy. But the most shocking change was to their brains. Constantly being deprived of food does strange things to your psyche. Food became their only preoccupation. Hated Brussels sprouts. Didn't matter. Any food placed in front of these subjects was devoured, the plate licked clean. Some subjects brought cookbooks and menus from local restaurants and read them over and over again. They pored over newspapers, memorizing and comparing prices for tomatoes and eggs. Even watching a movie became a peculiar experience. The volunteers wouldn't remember the plot or the characters but recalled in vivid detail any time the characters ate something. In a recent study that took place in a lab, subjects were separated into those who had eaten lunch and those who hadn't. When seated in front of a screen flashing words like take, break, and cake for 1/30th of a second, those who hadn't eaten correctly identified the food words far more often than the control group did. 5. When you don't have enough of something, it becomes the most important thing in your life. Everything else is secondary. The experiment changed the subjects not only physically, but mentally as well. This is the scarcity mindset. When someone's starving, their brain ignores almost everything except that one thing it doesn't have. My scarcity mindset. In 1958, Communist Party leader Chairman Mao began a campaign known as the Great Leap Forward. It was an attempt to rapidly modernize China's economy from agrarian to industrialized in order to compete with the West. Only, it was crafted by someone with the economics knowledge of a toddler. Farming villages were given a quota of steel to produce, despite the fact that the average villager had zero knowledge of how to, produce steel. Villagers abandoned their farming efforts and built backyard furnaces. They melted their pots and pans to meet the quotas. This quickly caused what became known as the Great Chinese Famine, which ravaged the countryside for 3 years. Meanwhile, the government exported grain to the West, Cuba, and Africa, despite severe domestic food shortages, to advertise how well Mao's plan was working. People were dropping like flies, while foreign aid was refused. Private ownership of land was forbidden, and growing your own crops was labeled counter-revolutionary and punishable by death, assuming, of course, you weren't already dead from starvation. After every blade of grass, every leaf, and even insects had been picked clean, people started eating clay. The clay was called Guan Yin after the goddess of mercy, a fairy-like goddess in white robes worshipped for her compassion and kindness. Since this type of clay was white, people thought the goddess of mercy had blessed it to save them. The clay of course had the opposite effect, and many people died painfully from bowel blockage. Even so, people still ate it, just to have some relief from their hunger pains. On his walk to school, my dad would regularly hear a thud and look over to see a schoolmate slumped into a heap. He summarizes this time by saying, "My only wish was to be full." During the worst month of the famine, my dad's best friend, Wen, saved his life by giving him a bite of a half-rotten sweet potato he found in a farmer's field. It had been missed when the government confiscated the harvest, and if he'd been caught, he would have been executed. To this day, sweet potato is one of my father's favorite foods. Wen died, like so many of my dad's friends, of starvation, just a few months before the famine finally ended in 1962. Since then, my dad has gotten his wish of knowing what it's like to be full. But food is still his obsession. I wasn't ever allowed to waste it. Every piece of an animal had to be eaten, from head to tail, the marrow sucked clean from the bones. That's why he found it so strange that chickens in Western supermarkets were packaged as thigh, breast, or wings. Didn't these chickens have heads? Necks? Feet? Thinking of those unwanted parts tossed away made his heart ache. My dad's story taught me how scarcity takes over your mind. I didn't live through a famine, so my life was already a major step up from his. Even though I didn't own a pair of underwear or socks that wasn't patched and repatched by my mom until there were more patches than sock, even though I got bullied for my thrift store clothes and DIY haircuts, and even though I became exceptionally good at pretending to be sick to avoid field trips that my parents couldn't afford, I never forgot how lucky I was. But growing up in poverty created a scarcity mindset in me, too. I was obsessive about money. In 1988, my dad got a chance to immigrate to Canada for his PhD, leaving me and my mom back in China. On my 7th birthday, he sent me a musical birthday card. Dad told me he had bought it in a dollar store. I did the calculation quickly. $1 Canadian was around 3 CNY at the time, which meant that this one card could have fed my family for almost 2 days. 6. It was by far the most precious thing I had ever owned. So of course, I went around the neighborhood, playing it over and over and smacking whoever's dirty hands dared to get near it. I wrapped it in a cloth and kept it under my shirt as if it were a baby bird that needed constant tending. Several months later, its tiny battery ran out and it died a glorified death. But I'll never forget the time I was the proud owner of the most expensive and special card in the whole world. 2 years later, after Mom and I had immigrated to join my dad in Canada, he decided to take me to the toy store for the first time in my life. He picked up a stuffed bear from the shelf. I looked at the price tag and gasped. $5 was enough to feed our cousins back in China for more than a week. I returned that overpriced bear to its shelf and pulled him over to the bin with the giant orange sign that said sale, 50 cents. Afterward, I made him send the remaining $4.50 to our cousins, and I felt amazing every time I thought about how they would be fed for a week because of my sacrifice. The scarcity mindset does have its downsides, though. When I was 9, we lived in a tiny one-bedroom apartment near Dad's university. The entire place was furnished with mismatched, half-broken furniture my parents salvaged from the curb or picked out from the dumpster. But compared to the concrete box where we had lived in China, with no heating, damp floors, and a bathroom that was just a hole in the ground, it was a palace. One day I came home from school to find that I had lost my key. After turning my school bag upside down and digging through all my books, gym clothes, and pencil case, I still couldn't find it. A cold feeling of dread filled my chest. I delayed the inevitable as long as possible, but after dinner I had to fess up. For the $30 that was required to replace the lock, I had to pay the price. And by that, I mean my mother beat me. Not only did I gain a crazy high pain threshold that day, I'm basically Wolverine, I also confirmed my suspicion that when you're poor, money is the most important thing in the world, because money is survival. You don't make careless mistakes because if you do, people go hungry, or even die. Look, I'm not telling you these stories because I want you to weep over my messed up childhood or applaud how far I've come. I want to show that you don't need to grow up privileged to become a millionaire. As a child, I couldn't even fathom what a millionaire was. Was the cupboard full or was it empty? That's as much as I knew about money. My family started off in the bottom 1%, which rewired my brain to make it hyper-focused on what we lacked. That scarcity mindset made me prioritize financial security above everything else, and it is precisely that scarcity mindset that got me to where I am today, in the top 1%. These days, instead of digging through trash, I travel the world as a 35-year-old retiree. Rather than handicapping me, the scarcity mindset taught me the 3 lessons that would eventually turn me into a millionaire. Money is the most important thing in the world. Money is worth sacrificing for. Money is even worth bleeding for. Chapter 2. A peach syrup, cardboard boxes, and a can of Coke. The first time I felt rich was when my dad gave me a can of Coke. In China, Coca-Cola is called Kukukel, which means tasty fun. Back then I was lucky if my drinking water wasn't contaminated with parasites, so the idea of something being both tasty and fun blew my 7-year-old mind. Everywhere I went I saw ads showing rich, I assumed, kids in the West drinking Coca-Cola, and they made me want to be a rich kid so badly. So, on my first day in Canada, when Dad handed me a can of this tasty fun, my hands were shaking so much I could barely hold it upright. When I took my first sip, my head nearly exploded. Or so I thought. It was actually my capillaries. The excitement and sugar rush gave me a massive nosebleed. I was just about to turn 8, and I finally knew what a rich person's drink tasted like. Most people will tell you that Coke is cheap sugar water that rots your teeth and gives you diabetes. Not only that, pretty much anyone can afford it. But I knew none of that. I nursed mine for a week, savoring every drop. When I was done, Dad tried to throw it out, but that empty can was far too precious to just toss away. It became my cup, toothbrush holder, and hair roller. I named it Kankan and slept with it every night. Kankan was my constant companion until my father bought me that bargain bin teddy bear. That Coke was the most luxurious treat I'd ever had, so I protected it, maximized every ounce of enjoyment from it, and didn't let a drop go to waste. I didn't know it at the time, but that was the first lesson of the scarcity mindset. Business books love to dump on the scarcity mindset, saying that it holds you back. The idea is that if you focus on what you don't have rather than what you could have, you tend not to recognize the opportunities right in front of you. That's fine. In the context of being an entrepreneur, it's probably decent advice. But what those business authors don't understand is that nobody is operating under a scarcity mindset because they want to. They are forced to, because at some point, they didn't have enough resources, and the scarcity mindset helped them survive. Scarcity isn't always a bad thing. It can even be constructive. Think back to school. You have a big paper due in a month. You put off writing that paper by chatting up friends on social media, obsessing over the news, and watching reality TV. You procrastinate, because your resources, in this case, time, are plentiful. It's okay to dawdle because there's so much of them. But if the deadline were in a matter of hours or days, you'd use your time more wisely. You'd ignore that gossipy call from your bestie and that kangaroo video your cousin sent you, even though you know it'll be awesome. Those distractions can go to hell because you are now a tornado of productivity. With the deadline looming, you become laser focused and use every brain cell you have to finish the paper. This is the scarcity mindset at work. When time is scarce, you push yourself to get as much done as possible, because time is precious. The same goes for money. When you're flush with cash, you don't appreciate its value since you think there will always be more. But when you're poor, every penny is treasured. I learned to appreciate every dollar my parents earned, every cent I ever made from my newspaper route, and developed a near photographic memory for prices. Money was the single most important thing in our lives. Scarcity was the constraint that shaped my childhood creativity. And that was shitty in oh so many ways. But I consider it a net positive, because in order to be truly creative, constraints are necessary. If you've ever tried to write a novel, you know what I mean. Staring at a blank computer screen feels debilitating. With infinite directions to pursue, you end up paralyzed. But by imposing some constraints like learning how to structure your paragraphs, build a story arc, and write a scene, or doing the writing exercise, you start to see a path forward. Ernest Hemingway supposedly bet his friends he could write a story in just 6 words. They laughed at him. How could a handful of words possibly convey the depth of a full narrative? You wouldn't even have space to describe a single eyelash, never mind an entire character. But Hemingway did just that. Not only did he write that story, he even gave it emotional impact. Don't believe me? For sale, baby shoes. Never worn. 1. See how much oomph you can pack into a tiny space. That's what constraints do. Scarcity made me stronger. I'm no Hemingway, but just as that micro story revealed his ingenuity, growing up poor unleashed mine. Poverty taught me 4 vital skills that I still use today. Skills that I like to call crap: creativity, resilience, adaptability, and perseverance, the acronym being a fitting metaphor because of all the crap I had to wade through to get them. Creativity. When I was 10 years old, I dreamed of owning a Barbie dream house. I had seen the commercial repeatedly because we had only 4 channels. Even now, more than 25 years later, I can remember it vividly, the camera zooming in on the 2 happy girls putting Barbie on her pink satin bedspread, then pulling back as they flicked on the street lamp outside her window, giggling. As badly as I wanted it, though, I didn't bother asking for such an extravagant gift for my birthday or Christmas. I knew my parents couldn't afford it. The stupid thing cost so much money, I didn't even think Santa could afford it. But the pull of the dollhouse was strong. So, one day, when I noticed some perfectly good cardboard boxes just sitting in the dumpster outside our apartment, I grabbed them. Back in my room, which also doubled as my parents' bedroom, a workspace, and storage space, I dug around a desk drawer until I found a pencil and a pair of scissors. I drew squares for the windows, marked the front and back doors, and, with surgical precision, started cutting. By denting together 2 pieces of cardboard, I made a roof. Then, by gluing together the cutouts from the doors, I built a mattress. I added the finishing touch by transforming the scraps from my mom's sewing pouch into a floral bedspread. I stepped back to admire my masterpiece. My scrappy little dollhouse looked nothing like the one in the commercial, but I didn't care. Making it had been so much fun. Who cared if it didn't have a parking space for Barbie's car, sold separately, or working light fixtures? Whenever I got bored of watching infomercials and maneuvering my toys, I went to the library, where I found an entire building full of books, and I could take up to 15 at a time without anyone's calling the cops. I couldn't believe it. At first, I could only read in Chinese, so I stuck to the foreign languages section. One day I was walking down the aisle, letting my fingers wander over the spines, when one book caught my eye. It was A Little Princess, translated into Chinese. When I got to the checkout, the librarian had to gently coax me into letting go of it, just for a second, so she could scan it for me. I devoured the book in 3 days. The story was about a girl named Sarah, who's so rich she has her own maid, carriage, and pony. But she's also kind and generous. Her father sends her to a fancy boarding school, so he can go off to war, but not before investing his entire fortune in a diamond mine. Then he dies on the battlefield, and not only that, all the money vanishes. The headmistress steals Sarah's belongings to pay for her school fees, and she is forced to work as a servant at the school. This riches to rags story was the exact opposite of my life, which made it intriguing as hell. I kept reading. I started to read English books, too, the Babysitter's Club series, R.L. Stein's Goosebumps, and Christopher Pike's Spooksville. Eventually, I had enough of a grasp of English to write my own stories. That launched my childhood love of writing, which later morphed into my dream of becoming an author. 25 years later, The culmination of that dream is sitting in your hands. All because my family couldn't afford cable. Resilience. When I was 13, my right eye swelled shut from a wasp sting. This had the effect of making me look like Cyclops, which wasn't exactly helpful in improving my social status as a self-conscious teenager. But we didn't have the money to buy the $15 anti-inflammatory medication, so I simply put on a pair of thrift store shades and went to school pretending to be a rapper. Weirdly, this didn't endear me to my peers, who were already bullying me on the regular. But hey, when your parents can't afford to throw money at a problem, you learn to tough it out. Nice pants, a schoolmate would say behind my back, voice dripping with sarcasm. I know. I have good taste, I would retort, smiling and pretending to brush crumbs off my faded overalls. Your parents are poor. Number. They're billionaires who are just really into hobo chic. I think this is why years later, when I finally moved from poverty into the middle class on a computer engineer's salary, I never fell into the trap of fear of missing out, FOMO, also known as keeping up with the Joneses. I'd developed Teflon skin early on, so while my coworkers were blowing their incomes on cars, clothes, and houses, and working unhealthily long hours to keep it all together, I didn't give a rat's ass about what anyone thought. Adaptability. As a kid, we moved around a lot, chasing cheap rent so my parents could send the savings back to our family in China. Every time, I'd end up in a new school district, lose the friends I had been able to make, and have to start all over again. The first time we had to move, I broke down into sobs. My dad pulled me aside, held my chin between his hands, and looked me directly in the eyes. I know you're sad you're leaving your friends. But I found a cheaper place that will save us money. Your cousins are counting on this money to go to school, and they have so much less than you. You don't want to let them down, do you? That shut me up. This is why discomfort and setbacks never faze me. In university, I figured out how to stretch the money I made from my internships until it covered tuition, rent, food, and everything else. I lived in a $300 a month basement room, but it was no big deal. Sure, it had its fair share of dust and black flies, and was scorching hot in the summer without air conditioning, but that just meant I spent more time at the library, reading. And, hey, at least I had a bulletproof security system, a branch I used to wedge the window closed. It wasn't glamorous, but the adaptability I'd honed in my childhood allowed me to cover all my expenses, and I graduated with zero debt. Perseverance. Getting my degree is one of the most difficult things I've ever done. I was enrolled in one of the toughest undergrad programs in the country, computer engineering at the University of Waterloo, the MIT of Canada, as it's known. I realized what I was in for the very first week of freshman year. While students in other tracks were making friends, getting drunk, and partying, we were getting our asses kicked by 2 intense exams. Those who didn't pass had to take remedial courses on top of a full course load. I swear, if you were ever drowning in the ocean, Waterloo would find some way to tie rocks to your feet because life is just too damn easy. Luckily, I had heard about the exams ahead of time, so I flanked those bastards by giving up my summer to study. But it all paid off. As soon as I graduated, not only was I able to cover my costs, I had 2 years of internship experience and a killer RA copyright, some A copyright. And guess what? I had mediocre grades at best. My lab partners always got straight A's, while it would take me 10 hours to understand a simple concept, only to end up with a C. That didn't stop me, though. I knew I didn't have to be the best. If I could just pass and get my degree, this grueling program would pay for itself. If I had to work psychotically hard to force my slow-learning brain to understand impossibly difficult subjects, so be it. If I had to drag my sleep-deprived body through the trenches, so be it. Hell, one time I even went as far as chugging an entire bottle of Buckley's cough syrup. Their motto is "It tastes awful." And it works, to stay awake during an exam because I was sick as a dog and hadn't slept for 2 weeks. Somehow, I passed, even though I barely remember any of it. Invisible waste. You'd think reliving these stories would make me sad, but in fact, I look back on my childhood and young adult years with fondness. Not only did I survive, I have some pretty happy memories. Also, my experience gave me an outsider-looking-in perspective on Western culture that has served me well. People write to me all the time asking if I can help analyze their financial situation, and they send balance sheets showing spending multiple times higher than what I spend each year now as a millionaire. When I politely, or not so politely, point this out, their reaction is, "I can't think of a single thing I can cut back on." We'll discuss more about the biochemical reason why this happens in Chapter 8, but one of the most valuable lessons I got from growing up poor was the ability to identify invisible waste. Let me give you an example. When I was a kid, I desperately wanted to get diabetes. Weird, right? Let me explain. Diabetes, to me, was the most prestigious disease in the world. Only rich people, or at least people who had enough money to buy piles and piles of candy, could afford to get it. So, once I immigrated, I spent a good part of my childhood eating and drinking a ton of sugar. I especially loved canned peaches. But I never got to eat the peaches themselves, just the syrup. My mom worked at a Chinese buffet washing dishes, and every time the waitresses filled up a container of peach halves for the dessert bar, they'd throw away the syrup. And Mom would be waiting, ready to snatch it before it got dumped down the drain. I got addicted to the stuff, drinking it at all hours of the day. It made me happy, not just because of all that free sugar but because we no longer had to throw away money buying milk or juice. I could subsist on peach syrup, water, and whatever else the restaurant tossed at the end of the day. It was heaven. I told that story to a friend of mine recently and she was absolutely horrified. But that was my world. I didn't know food groups or recommended daily servings. My food was basically the packaging your food came in. You ate the fruit, I drank the syrup. If you haven't gotten the theme yet, here it is. Other people's garbage was my treasure. And as I assimilated, I realized how much waste is completely invisible. The Guardian estimates that as much as 60 million tons of food are wasted every year in the United States alone, just because it's misshapen or discolored. 2. This is a third of all the food being produced. That's just the tip of the iceberg. Americans throw away 11 million tons of clothing a year. 11 million tons. That's even worse than the food because it can take hundreds of years to biodegrade, so it just sits in our landfills with all the plastic bags and last year's cell phones, slowly destroying the environment. Western society always strives for more. But is more the key to our happiness? Studies show that any bump in happiness related to financial security maxes out with a $75,000 salary. 4. After that, more doesn't actually seem to help when it comes to well-being. Statistics also show that a salary of just $34,000 a year makes you part of the top 1% in the world. 5. If a container of beach syrup can thrill a kid who doesn't know otherwise, then maybe we don't need much either. Some, or even most, of what you're buying isn't making you happy. Some of your spending is waste, plain and simple. Making invisible waste visible. Let's do an exercise to find out just how much invisible waste exists in your life. Exercise: eliminating invisible waste. Materials: a closet, some masking tape. Open your closet. Push everything to the left. Take an empty hanger and wrap a piece of masking tape around it, as shown here, and hang it at the far right. For the next month, every time you wear an item of clothing, after you wash it, hang it to the right of the marked hanger. Over time, this will reveal how often you wear certain items. The stuff all the way at the right is what you wear most frequently. Toward the center, but still to the right of the marked hanger, are pieces you wear, but not recently. To the left of the marked hanger are clothes you never take out at all. The longer you do this, the more accurate your closet map will become, and you'll be able to get a sense of how much is active, meaning what is in regular rotation. Similarly, you'll learn the percentage of your closet that's dormant and never sees the light of day. Don't worry, you don't have to toss out the clothes you don't wear. But hopefully you'll start thinking about invisible waste and how easily it can sneak into your life. We'll be using the information gleaned here when we examine in Chapter 8 why we all buy more than we need. In our culture, the scarcity mindset is portrayed as pure deprivation, a hindrance to a child's development. But growing up with that perspective helped me in ways I could never have predicted when I was that kid in China pining over a can of Coke. Scarcity is a powerful constraint. It taught me to wade through the crap to become more creative, resilient, and adaptable, and to persevere to build the life I have today. Scarcity also allowed me to quickly identify invisible waste. It's time to start pinpointing it in your life, too. Chapter 3. Be educated or die. The classroom door flew open. 10 men in bulletproof vests stormed in, assault rifles pointed at us. Police. Hands on your heads. I did as I was told, but my first instinct was to dive under my desk. Judging by their wide-eyed terror, my classmates felt the same way. The final exam, which had seemed so pivotal just minutes before, was forgotten. Pencils rolled onto the floor and exam papers fluttered in the air. You know how when there's bad turbulence, everyone turns to look at the flight attendant? Well, our teacher looked even paler than the walls of the classroom. That's how I knew this wasn't a drill. A kid at my high school had been spotted with a gun. It was June 2000, just 1 year after the Columbine shootings, so the police understandably took it seriously. It took 30 minutes, which felt like forever, to search everyone, classroom by classroom, until our principal announced over the intercom that the SWAT team had cleared the building. With shaky legs, we filed out and assembled at a designated area on the football field. I called my dad to tell him what had happened and asked for a ride home. He said, "If the exam is still on, don't leave." Even though neither the suspect nor the gun had been located yet. At the time, I was just a teeny tiny bit peeved about being abandoned in an active shooter scenario. As I walked home after the test was cancelled, I racked my brain trying to remember the number for child services. It wasn't until many years later, when I asked Dad about how he came to this country, that I began to understand where he was coming from. To me, it seemed as if school were more important to him than my life. To him, school was more important than his life. When my dad was 17, he was forcibly removed from high school and sent to the countryside as part of his education. This happened during the Cultural Revolution, a decade-long period of class warfare exploited by Chairman Mao to take back control over the Communist Party. After his great leap forward, which aimed to convert China from an agrarian society to an industrial and face planted, causing 3 years of famine and killing millions, he realized he had to do something drastic to consolidate power and prevent a coup. Anyone who was considered bourgeois, teachers, doctors, landowners, people who worked for the opposition party, was branded an anti-revolutionary. My grandfather, having worked as a medic for the Kuomintang, the nationalist party, which opposed the communists during the Civil War, fell into that category, along with my grandmother, my dad, and his 4 siblings. They were all guilty by association. My dad spent the better part of his youth at 10 years doing back-breaking labor in the countryside. Using primitive tools, his job was to haul massive boulders to and from a quarry, under a blazing hot sun, surviving on meager rations. Once, while hauling a 200-pound rock with a friend, he slipped in the wet mud, rolled down a hill, and almost got crushed to death. He lost hope of having a future or any chance of improving his situation. Every day was as grueling and hopeless as the last. In 1977, after Chairman Mao died, the new leader, Deng Xiaoping, decided to overhaul the system and reopen the schools. The National College Entrance Exam, C, or Gaokao, which dates back to 1952 and can be taken by anyone, regardless of political or socio-economic status, was reinstated. It dawned on my dad, a factory worker at this point, that this was his shot. The 3-day exam tested comprehension in every high school subject, despite the fact that during the Cultural Revolution most students had been kicked out of school and never graduated. Dad describes December 10, 1977, as the most unforgettable day in his life. His father woke him up at 4:30 a.m. to cook him breakfast, and his parents watched him eat in silent devotion. As he boarded the bus, He looked back at my frail and coughing grandfather, who had been ill for years following the denouncements and hard labor of the Cultural Revolution. Not only did his future rest on the results of this exam, but his entire family's future, including his 4 siblings, did as well. So, you can imagine the pressure he was under. Millions of people were competing for a coveted university spot. Then he was referred to as 1,000 soldiers and their horses trying to cross a log. The odds were not in my dad's favor. But as you may suspect by now, he got in. In fact, he got 60 points more than the required score and was admitted to a top university. He found out later that 5.7 million people had taken the exam that year and only 4.8% passed. The news quickly spread in his small town. Even the people who had previously ostracized my grandparents started treating them with respect. Education was how my dad got out from under the thumb of a totalitarian government. So, he wasn't overly sympathetic whenever I complained that a subject was too hard or I was too tired to go to school or the school was closed because a gunman was on the loose. You tough it out. Because your entire family is depending on you. I still think he should have come and picked me up, though. The Gaokao is still the most important exam in a Chinese student's life. I've heard similar stories from Vietnamese friends for their parents. Getting an education was also a matter of life and death. During the Vietnam War, students with the highest marks were kept behind to fill political roles, while their peers were conscripted into the army, which meant that the kids with better grades were the ones who survived. We've all heard of amazing kids like Malala Yousafzai, who faced death threats for going to school, and Ugandan immigrant Twisachai Jackson Kigori, whose family scrimped and saved to get him a number 2 pencil, the price of admission to his local school. These are extreme cases, I know, but around the world, education often remains the only way out of poverty. Even in the United States, getting an undergraduate degree increases your average salary by 70%. No matter where you are, education has the power to change your life by improving your earning power. Not only that, one longitudinal study demonstrated that a lack of education can be as harmful to your health as smoking. Education improves your ability to process and understand information. Education also helps you become more curious and self-sufficient and teaches you how to trade short-term pain for long-term gain. People who drop out of high school die, on average, a decade earlier than their peers who have a bachelor's degree. But more than 10% of Americans ages 24 to 35, over 8 million people, don't have a high school degree. Maybe you're with me. Or maybe you're rolling your eyes, wanting to throw names like Richard Branson and Katy Perry in my face, to prove that it's possible to drop out and still make it big. But, as I'm sure you secretly know, these lucky people are the exception, not the rule. If you want to extend your salary and your life, education is pretty much the best bet. After all, if it weren't for that exam, I wouldn't be here. Even though I grew up in poverty, too, my father laid the groundwork for my success, and he never let me forget it. It wasn't until he got his PhD after years in Canada that he finally found a job as a research scientist for the government, and that's when things started to turn around. Dad has always played the long game. And he was right. All the blood, sweat, and tears to get my degree were worth it in the end. But as you'll see in the next chapter, not all college degrees are created equal.